The Syrian Civil War. When you talk about the Syrian Civil War and wanting to understand it, as usual you have to go back in time. What is now Syria was a part of the Ottoman Empire up until it collapsed at the end of the First World War. It then became part of the French governing mandate agreed to by the victorious Allies. Syria was and still is a fractured land with many different religious and ethnic groups. First, you have the Alawite Muslims of the northwestern province of Latakia on the Mediterranean coast. The Alawites played ball with the French occupiers, which enabled them to take over the country later on, despite making up only 10 to 15% of the population. Next, you have the Druze people of the south of Damascus, who make up around 5% of the population and follow a faith that is a mixture between pagan beliefs, Christianity and Islam. Then you have the two Sunni Muslim groups of the Arabs, who make up over 70% of the population, and the Kurds of the east, who make up around 10%. Initially, the French ruled over a Syria that was fractured between multiple states, but they managed to get them more or less under the same flag. For the next few decades, Syria was a fledgling state trying to find its place in the world until the new Arab nationalist and socialist movement of Baathism took hold in the form of Hafez al-Assad. Al-Assad was a military officer who took power in a bloodless coup in 1971. Assad represented the Alawite minority who had been playing a large role in governing the country before. He took the side of the Soviets in the Cold War and encountered many problems from the majority Sunni population. These problems culminated in the Islamist uprisings that started in 1976 with the city of Homs as its main base of support. This largely insurgency war would last for 6 years and was supported by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood organization, which advocated for the implementation of Islamic Sharia law across the Muslim world and is viewed as a precursor organization to Al-Qaeda. Eventually, Assad crushed the uprising, but his son and successor Bashar al-Assad would have to deal with this problem again. In the year 2000, Hafez al-Assad died and his son Bashar took power. Continuing his father's legacy, he ruled with an authoritarian iron fist and was close with Russia and very anti-Israel. The powder keg in Syria exploded in 2011 at the beginning of the Arab Spring protests across the Middle East. Assad's army cracked down on the protests violently, and so the country spiraled into chaos and civil war. Many of the rebel groups that formed immediately began getting assistance from the United States, Turkey, and the Arab Gulf states. On the rebel side, you had different groups who espoused secular nationalist beliefs and motivations, and others who had a more Islamic jihadist bent. You also had the Kurds in the northeast, who more or less broke off from the country and fought the rebels. The war was not going well for the Assad regime until first Iran through its proxy terrorist group Hezbollah, and then the Russians intervened in 2015. The Russians' motivation was retaining their naval base in Latakia and overall engaging in great power politics with the United States. The Iranians and Hezbollah intervened for similar reasons also, and the Iranians wanted to retain their land route through friendly Assad-ruled Syria to supply their proxy group Hezbollah in Lebanon. As the war drug on, Assad and his new allies gradually turned the tide and pushed the rebels out of all areas around the capital Damascus and the other major cities of Aleppo, Hama, and Homs. Meanwhile, the ISIS jihadist terror organization carved out a new state in the deserts of central and eastern Syria and northern and central Iraq. This was a short-lived state and was largely destroyed by 2017 due to Russian and American airstrikes coupled with a highly motivated Kurdish ground force. The Turks launched a limited intervention that pushed the Kurds off their border. There has long been a conflict between Turkey and its own Kurdish minority. The war ground onto a stalemate until Russia, Turkey, and Iran agreed to a ceasefire between the government and the rebels. The government retained control over Damascus in the south, Homs and Hama in the center-west of the country, Latakia in the northwest, and Aleppo in the north. The rebels in northern Idlib province, while ISIS still had a presence in the desert interior, and the Kurds largely had control in the northeast. Meanwhile, Turkey still tangled with the Kurds. The Americans established a base on the Syrian-Jordanian border in the oil-rich region, and the Israelis conducted regular airstrikes on Iranian and Hezbollah targets in the country. This changed when the rebel group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham led a lightning offensive out of Idlib province, which they controlled since the ceasefire, into the northern city of Aleppo. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short, is an umbrella group that is made up of largely jihadist and Islamist rebel groups, including al-Qaeda in Syria. This alliance of terrorists, mercenaries and jihadists on November 27th quickly swept away the old rotten and corrupt edifice that was the Assad government. Meanwhile, another group called the Syrian National Army, who are backed by Turkey, are fighting with the Kurds in the north and have their own disagreements with HTS. So to say the least, the future of Syria remains uncertain. But what is certain is that the Syria that existed before is no more, and likely it will fragment into at least 4 new states. The first one being the HTS state, which encompasses most of the population in the core cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Hama and Homs. The second being this northern area on Turkey's border, ruled by the Syrian National Army, and the third and fourth being the Kurd-ruled northeast, and possibly an independent Alawite state in Latakia.